good morning, good evening, and afternoon, depending on where you are today. And thank you for tuning in into the first of a series of intellectual encounters that's called The Borders of Astrobiology. My name is Alessandra Marino, and I'm a research fellow in international development and inclusive innovation within AstrobiologyOU. If you haven't encountered us yet, AstrobiologyOU is an interdisciplinary group. We are based at the Open University in the UK, and our work tries to address the scientific, governance, and ethical challenges faced by astrobiology and related exploration missions. On behalf of the group, I have the pleasure today and the honor to welcome you all to our first of this short series that's called The Borders of Astrobiology. This series consists of 3 events that attempt to stretch, flex, and even displace the disciplinary borders of astrobiology. From different standpoints and at the intersection of different fields and knowledges, speakers will consider the possibilities of promoting ecologically aware and inclusive approaches to knowing and doing space research. Today's discussion explicitly grapples with how to formulate images, horizons, and visions of futures that can be imagined and then performatively brought about, actively shaped. To say it with philosopher of science Donna Haraway, it matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. That was very much what I had in mind when I started to think about how to shape today's event. And to kick us off with reflections on the potentialities of the speculative dimension and disciplinary practices of astrobiology and anthropology, we have today as our keynote speaker, Professor Juan Francisco Salazar. Juan is an anthropologist and a documentary filmmaker with a PhD in communication and media from Western Sydney University. He is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and Professor of Communications at Western Sydney University, where he's also a Professorial Fellow of the Institute for Culture and Society. He is co-chair of the Future Earth Australia National Steering Committee and past co-chair of the Humanities and Social Sciences Expert Group of the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research. He has undertaken cultural and ethnographic research on Antarctica since 2011 and currently leads the Australia Research Council funded project Australia, a spacefaring nation, Imaginaries of Space Futures. On a personal note, I'm incredibly happy to welcome Juan because his work, both in content and language, experiments with creating figurations for worlds to be that take seriously the relationships and types of knowledge that emerge in and from extreme environments. I just want to mention the importance for me and for my rethinking of the discipline of his film Nightfall on Gaia, which mixes realism and speculative fiction and puts the notion of life at the extreme center stage, prompting us to consider the shifting meaning of extremity and habitability, 2 terms that are crucial to astrobiology in our changing planetary socio-ecological context. So from Antarctica as a lab for science and a repository of data, Nightfall on Gaia leads viewers to consider Antarctica as an ecological watchtower, one which stands for the possibility of more caring planetary futures and of even rethinking care beyond our planet. So keeping in mind this call for replacing extractivism with care, today's event revolves around one main question: what happens to astrobiology? Or if one starts from astrobiology, when justice and ethics enlighten possible modes of relating to environments on and off Earth. Today, Juan will speak for about 30 minutes, and then a panel of incredible and supportive colleagues and friends from AstrobiologyOU will provide short reflections and responses. At this point, I would like to really thank the panel who has agreed to support and kickstart today's conversation. Let me quickly introduce them. Shonil Bhagwat will start the conversation. Shonil is Professor of Environment and Development at the Open University. He is the lead of the International Development Workstream in AstrobiologyOU, and his research interests sit at the cross-section between natural and social sciences and center on the links between environment and development. In particular, his research engages critically with discussions on a variety of key environmental concerns: agriculture and food security, biodiversity conservation, climate change, ecosystem services, and sustainability. The second speaker today is Karen Olsson-Francis, who is Professor of Geomicrobiology and Director of AstrobiologyOU, and very much the reason why we're all together today. Her research focuses on understanding how microorganisms live in extreme environments, can live in extreme environments, and their role in biogeochemical cycling. She's particularly interested in microorganisms that live in rocky environments, their diversity, and the role that they play in mineral weathering. She's part of international collaborations that work in Ethiopia and Botswana. Karen is also a member of the European Astrobiology Institute Executive Board, and she's co-lead of the workstream Early Life and Extremophiles. She's also the UK representative on the COSPA Planetary Protection Panel. Finally, we have Nisha Ramkissoon, who is a postdoc within AstrobiologyOU and a planetary scientist. Her research uses laboratory experiments and modeling to explore how various processes, such as hypervelocity impacts hydrothermal processes and biological activity can influence the evolution of planetary bodies within the solar system. Her current research focuses on determining if geochemical signatures generated via microbe-silicate interaction could be detected by space missions, and if these signatures could be used to determine if microbes have ever existed on potentially habitable bodies, such as Mars or Europa. Nisha also investigates the effect of meteorite impacts on planetary bodies. So thanks again, all of you that are listening, for your patience while I go through this long introduction. I want to encourage you to listen in, but also to ask questions. What we will do is we will have a 30 minutes keynote, then we will have the panel discussion, but we will leave plenty of time for a Q&A. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box at any point. At this point, though, I'm going to leave the floor to Juan Francisco Salazar and his talk entitled Situating Astrobiology, Abductive Reasoning, Speculative Thinking, and Planetary Futures. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning to you all. I wish to first thank Dr. Alessandra Marino for inviting me to share some of my work today in this interdisciplinary conversation about astrobiology. I am speaking from Gadigal and Wangal country in Sydney along the Cooks River, previously known as Wullayari, that you have there in your images, before European settlement. And I wish to acknowledge that this is unceded country and pay respects to the traditional elders and knowledge holders who continue to care and nurture this land. It's just after 8 p.m. tonight. I wish to also acknowledge in advance the colleagues at OU who will be responding: Professor Karen Olsson-Francis, Professor Shonil Bhagwat, and Dr. Nisha Ramkissoon, and thank them for their time tonight and all the team behind the scenes. I'm really honored with this invitation. I was invited to speak to the question of what happens to astrobiology when justice and ethics enlighten possible modes of relating to environments on and off Earth, and that's what I try to do. But my presentation today does not have one single line of argument. It is a bit more messy and loose, more like a series of vignettes, which hopefully, however, act as provocations to spark more conversations, which may positively lead to grounded interventions in our diverse research practices and collaborations with a range of actors in and outside of academia. First, let me declare my love as an amateur for astrobiology. Edward Said wrote about amateurism in his critique of the professionalism of intellectual labor. Amateurism, he wrote, is the desire to be moved not by profit or reward, but by love for an unquenchable interest in the larger picture, in making connections across lines and barriers, in refusing to be tied down to a specialty, in caring for ideas and values despite the restrictions of a profession. Anthropologist Tim Ingold, approaching anthropological work also as an amateur, writes, "The amateur is literally one who studies a subject for the love of it, motivated by a sense of care and affection, personal involvement and responsibility." This is how I see my approach to astrobiology in the last 8 years that I've been reading about it, engaging with it from afar, and especially as some of the key questions in astrobiology about the origins of life, detection of life as we know it, and detection of life as we don't know it. It's also pertaining other realms outside of the sciences. Anthropology has for a long time been interested in the philosophy of biology and in astrobiology. Anthropologist Stefan Helmreich, for instance, who has worked with microbiologists and oceanographers and written extensively about astrobiology and the nature of alien life, has argued that astrobiology is in part an enterprise that depends upon abduction, abductive reasoning, hard science, and speculative thinking together. Helmreich sees astrobiology as perfect mode of athwart theorizing, or what Istvan Pryatt, also a UK-based anthropologist who has also written extensively about astrobiology, refers to a hotbed of transversal thinking. I also wish to acknowledge at the outset a huge amount of work already happening in this area, discussing astrobiology and society, especially in Europe, from a wide range of disciplines from which I have learned a lot, but also from which I think my work differs. And difference is where I'd like to begin this intervention into not only what astrobiology is, but also what astrobiology does. My starting point is an invitation to look at astrobiology not only as a discipline or a group of disciplines or fields of knowledge making in themselves or in itself, but in relation to other fields and knowledge making processes, in this case, anthropology, by extension, other social sciences, such as geography and sociology, but also speculative fiction, both in literature and cinema, and today, especially indigenous ways of knowing. Let's start then by imagining astrobiology as a pebble or a stone. Think of anthropology also as a pebble or a stone of a different shape but similar mass. Now, if we gently drop these stones into a pond simultaneously, we should, in all likelihood, observe two overlapping concentric circles or shapes, a diffraction pattern against each other, within each other. They create a relationship and entanglement. I'm drawing here on the work of Karen Barad, a feminist theorist working in philosophy of physics, cultural studies of science, and feminist science studies. She speaks of practices of diffraction, of reading diffractively for patterns of differences, in this case, across these disciplines, in ways that can move beyond critique and be suggestive, creative, and visionary. Her method of diffractively reading insights through one another, attentively and carefully, reading for differences that matter and paying attention to the ethics that are on those entanglements. For Barad, diffractive readings bring inventive provocations, they are good to think with, they're respectful, detailed, ethical engagements. And this is the impetus tonight to read astrobiology diffractively in relation to other forms of knowledge making about the life in the universe. So the invitation is not to see astrobiology in itself, as I said, but in this entanglement as a kind of interaction that could expand into a wider ecology of practices. A primary pursuit of astrobiology are signatures of life, biosignatures that suggest that life was or is present or could develop and emerge in the future. The search for fingerprints of life, for indices of life, traces of life. Biologists have speculated whether life is a property of planets or of individual organisms. Harold Morowitz proposes a systems view of life where environmental fluxes and biological fluxes are entangled in a reciprocity of influence, what Bhagwat might understand as an interaction. One notable example from literature and cinema is, of course, Stanislav Lem's 1961 novel Solaris, taken to the big screen by Andrei Tarkovsky a decade later, in what is regarded as one of the best science fiction films of all time, where a human crew attempts to make sense of a planet-girdling sentient ocean in an exoplanet. Or the brilliant short film Proxima B by Julia Grossman, narrated by Ursula K. Le Guin, where the sentient planet, the rocks, speak back to us. These questions about sentient planets, sentient geologies, are linked to other pressing questions that I'd like to move on to now. Does astrobiology reproduce some of the limitations and colonial processes of other scientific practices? Yes and no. Working with meteorologists, Stefan Halmerick describes how one of them expressed quite bluntly to him how northern hemispheric assumptions are built right into the models, including of waves. That makes them challenging to use in the southern hemisphere. Helmreich has argued that in oceanography, the southern hemisphere has been similarly construed as a zone of unprocessed data, where what kind of data to collect is an ongoing political question. Anthropologists Jean and John Komarov describe how global south geographies and peoples are treated in social theory as a place of parochial wisdom, of antiquarian traditions, of exotic ways and means, and above all, of unprocessed data, reservoirs of raw fact. For Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, at stake here is the impossibility of communicating the unsayable. For the last 200 years, he observes, like many others have done, also before him and along him, the relationship between knowing and acting has lost its general character and been reduced to the relationship between knowledge validated by modern science industries. Feminist science scholars were already speaking about situated knowledges in the late 80s, of course. I want to bring to the fore also the recent work of Max Libwaron, Michif Settler, associate professor in geography at Memorial University in Newfoundland in Canada, a researcher and a designer. And they write about how coloniality sits in the default interface between science and policy, where indigenous peoples are constantly hearing of new discoveries about the nature of the universe, many of which are known to them in some way or another. She espouses an anti-colonial approach that requires science to take into account the role of imperialism and racism has played in the science sector. And science, I include the social sciences, of course. This includes entitlement and an extraction mentality as foundational to colonial thinking and research practice, where we assume, we scientists, social and natural scientists, assume our questions are valid, a level of intellectual authority, that our practices are safe, and the right to take from indigenous knowledge and science for the betterment of humanity. Scientific practice is violence, Libwaron claims, when it's premised on colonial land relations, assuming entitlement and access to indigenous land based on a relationship to land as resource. Knowledge production is always situated within relations and obligations, she notes. Methodology is ethics, methodology as ethics. I'll come back to this in a minute to speak briefly about work in Earth analog sites, but I guess methodology as ethics and knowledge production as situated within relations and obligations might be one first answer to the initial questions posed for today. What happens to astrobiology when justice and ethics enlighten possible modes of relating to environments on and off Earth. Relating to environments then also means relating to peoples that historically have cared for those environments, at least on Earth. Another term I have found valuable in my work, which I like to foreground today for discussion, is that of cognitive justice, introduced by the Indian scholar Shiv Viswanathan in his 1997 book, A Carnival for Science, Essays on Science, Technology and Development, where commenting on the destructive impact that often hegemonic Western science has had on developing countries and non-Western cultures, calls for recognizing of the plurality of knowledge and the right of different forms of knowledge to coexist, because different knowledges are connected with different livelihoods and lifestyles. I've written a little bit about this in relation to the bioprospecting of extremophiles in Antarctica. I spent several years traveling to Antarctica and working alongside marine microbiologists that were searching for extremophiles. Extremophile research is booming business in Antarctica as elsewhere, as I try to illustrate in my article, where microbiologists are flocking to Antarctica to bioprospect, sample, cultivate, sequence enzymes and proteins from an untapped cornucopia of genetic material. Many of the interviews I conducted, I asked the question, please summarize what Antarctica means to you in one sentence, one phrase, and it was surprising to hear many of them saying that an untapped source of genetic material. What do indigenous knowledge systems and oral traditions of knowledge teach us if we are to resist colonial modes of practice replicated in fieldwork, for instance, astrobiology in analog sites or anthropology in ethnographic sites? It is truly remarkable, and yet I think it has not received enough critical scholarly attention, how hundreds of these analog sites have sprung up in the past decade or so all over the world, from the Atacama Desert to the dry valleys in Antarctica, from Svalbard and the Canadian Arctic to Trinidad and Morocco, to Spain and Ethiopia, to Puerto Rico, to Aotearoa, and to the Australian deserts. Analog sites, I think everyone here tonight knows much better than I, are earthly landscapes and oceans that have been rendered analogs for extraterrestrial landscapes and oceans, alien landscapes and oceans in the most cosmic sense, as Stefan Helmreich might say. Models for extraterrestrial ecologies, surrogates for alternative worlds where extremophile microorganisms become proxy aliens, whether they need liquid water, a solvent, or perhaps, following abductive reasoning, ammonia, sulfuric acid, or methane. Here are more questions that I think are pertinent to animate astrobiology in relationship with other disciplines, as I mentioned at the beginning, as a scientific, but also as a cultural and political practice. How are we to understand, for instance, a potential methane-infused biosignature emanating from Mars or from the moon of Europa, when we might not have the right systems of representation and knowledge sense-making? Why must we pay attention and refuse the imposition of this alien imagination on sites that have profound entangled cultural environmental histories? Why and how do indigenous systems of representation and knowledge making become relevant then? What happens when models of one analog site are transposed from one site to another? Are they all the same? This is an urgent call, I think, for astrobiology, again, in relationship with the other disciplines mentioned, to resist reifying and reducing the understanding of Earth analog sites only as fountains of unprocessed microbial or geological data. In Australia, where most of the population call the interior of the continent the Outback, as you can see there, astrobiologists and anthropologists may be no different. In contrast, we have one of Australia's most celebrated contemporary author, Wani author Dr. Alexis Wright. She writes, there are many maps of the mind created from Australian myth-making about a fabled outback. These are the stories that Australia chose to tell itself and wanted to believe about a land that had been stolen from Aboriginal people. This is how imagination works in storytelling narratives. And sometimes these imagined stories become embedded in the national mind. To Aboriginal people, the term outback is an alien concept that implies that someone is a long way from home and home is somewhere else. We see our country as our as home, whether it is in the desert, the forest, or by the sea. The whole continent is our homeland and the foundation of our well-being and our belonging. For planetary scientists and astrobiologists in Australia, there are about 15 possible sites that may be used or that are used as analog sites. These include Woomera, Stark Ranges, the Simpson Desert, Lake Eyre, etc., and Arkarula, where you see the picture there. It would be significant to see how research practices and publications begin to acknowledge how these sites are, to start with, covered by ancient songlines that crisscross the continent and link people, places, knowledge, law, and land management practices. These songlines and song spirals are intimately connected to sky country and sky knowledge. We know that Aboriginal astronomy is the earliest known astronomical knowledge system anywhere in the world. Dr. Anne Pulina is a Yimardudwara Marnin, an indigenous woman from the Mardudwara. She's a scholar with 2 PhDs and an elder in the Yikina indigenous Australian tradition. And she notes, by singing the songlines, elders evoke and awaken the ancient stories of country. When you look at those stories, you see the connectivity between all of the elements, between the sky, between the earth, between the water, between the magnificent sacred sites that are in the landscape that connect our people through this ancient wisdom and these ancient stories in song. Country, caring, nurturance, caring for country, all forms of language that speak of the historical specificity of indigenous experience living in so-called analog sites. Anthropologist Deborah Bird-Rose has described country as a living entity with a yesterday, a today, and a tomorrow, with a consciousness and a will toward life. Think again of the ocean in Solaris. Country is not a generalized or undifferentiated type of place, something over there to be drawn or operated on, which is precisely how often the sciences operate or render these sites. Take, for instance, a related controversy as explored by DeAndre Smiles in his work on the settler logics of outer space. Smiles is an indigenous geographer who identifies as Ojibwe and Black and settler, and he has analyzed the struggle over Mauna, Awakea, and the 30-meter telescope 1.4 billion observatory that you know of, which is under construction on the mountain considered sacred to Kanaka Oiwi native Hawaiians. While many Kanaka Oiwi argue that TMT would desecrate one of the most sacred sites in the islands, a place revered as a house of worship, an ancestor, and an elder sibling in the Mo'okua Hau, or genealogical succession, advocates of big science justify the transgression by lauding the project's pledge to create jobs, stimulate the economy, and fund educational opportunities in STEM. Others repeat the premise of new discoveries that will explain the origins of our universe, a scientific ambition thought to generate myriads of benefits for all of humanity. These relations are important because they do illustrate what needs to change when we approach possible near future settlements in outer space. Astrobiologists argue that the preservation of biodiversity and of pristine environments on Earth is of the great importance for our ability to study life, its origin, distribution, and future. Many would definitely agree and support this, me included, of course. But this also posits some questions as it is a reductionist view on protection and conservation and the notion of wilderness. Michael Sean Fletcher, a graduate paleoecologist at the University of Melbourne, who has written persuasively about how Aboriginal people in Australia view wilderness, or what is called wild country, as sick land that has been neglected and not cared for. The principle of caring for country is the opposite of the romantic understanding of wilderness and pristineness as healthy, a view which underpins much non-Indigenous conservation efforts and which often excludes Indigenous and local people from many areas deemed wilderness, sometimes leading to the neglect and erasure of these lands. It is time to strike terms like wilderness from our lexicon, claims Fletcher. While they are just words, they're actually very powerful words, he adds. What are the other powerful words that astrobiology might strike through or reconsider in their lexicon? Manned spaceflight has been pretty much replaced by human spaceflight and mankind for humankind. What about colonization, exploration, final frontier? Geographer Julie Michelle Klinger argues that the status of outer space as the final frontier is a cultural fetish. What a given culture fetishizes reveals the blind spots of power in specific times and places. That outer space should be even considered a final frontier is only a recent historical phenomenon that reflects the fusion of political power with techno-optimism. Or as used in astrobiology, the hunt for life, which often comes with predatory connotations. This is one reason why the choice of words matter. Stories it matters what stories tell stories, Alessandra said at the beginning, especially when discussing space research, especially if we are to be open to this cognitive justice and develop platforms for dialogue across knowledge systems. There are so many more examples: the unwritten teachings of Mauturanga Maori way of being in Aotearoa, which is, like many indigenous knowledge systems, based strictly in empirical observations of the environment over thousands of years. The concept of Maori in Mauturanga Maori refers to the life that is found in all things natural, questioning some of the divisions in our Western science between what means to be alive and not alive, the biotic and the abiotic. How could a Maori-informed worldview enrich investigations of fundamental questions of knowledge posed by astrobiology? For instance, how did life originate from non-living matter? What is non-living matter? How is life distributed in the universe? And what is the nature of living systems? What if the universe and the apparently fundamental laws of physics were different? Maori scholar and activist Tina Ngata notes from a Maori worldview that starting where you are is a first principle for undertaking knowledge making, and it is encapsulated in the concept of whakapapa. Ngata illustrates how this highlights the primacy of relationships in everything we do. The likes of the International Astronomical Union, or NASA, have been making an important move towards decolonizing space by renaming celestial bodies with indigenous names, in some occasions with prior consultation with communities and elders. But here decolonization takes merely a metaphor. It is not really linked to a change in the colonial relations to land that I mentioned earlier, or to the primacy of relationships in everything we do, or to methodology as ethics. Another example is the Baguaca Collective, who have worked together since 2006. They are an indigenous and non-indigenous human more than human research collective. It includes Baguaca country, the indigenous country, and 8 women researchers, 5 Yolkun women, elders and caretakers of country, and 3 non-indigenous human geographers from 2 Australian universities. In a recent publication on talking back to space colonization, they argue that the extension of Earth-based colonization into space disrupts and colonizes the plural life worlds of many indigenous people who have an ongoing connection with and beyond the sky. In listening to Guwak, they aim to speak back to promoters of space colonization. They're talking more about new space and space 2.0 rather than the astrobiological and planetary sciences, who frame their project as harmless according to what they term 4 core understandings. First, the assumption that there are no people or other beings indigenous to outer space, that space is dead or non-sentient in itself, that space is clearly separated from Earth. And because of these 3 assumptions, they do not identify any ethical objections to occupying and exploiting space. The volumetric angle here is very interesting when asking ourselves the question with which we started tonight. What happens to astrobiology when justice and ethics enlighten possible modes of relating to environments on and off Earth? How can speculative thinking in astrobiology begin to embrace, or continue to embrace, I should say, social environmental justice embedded in profound notions such as caring for country, for sky country, but also the subterranean? A glimpse into this is the work of Chilean sociologist and anthropologist Manuel Tironi, who has been doing work along geologists, volcanologists, and Licanantay elders in the Salar de Atacama for many years now, especially Mrs. Sonia, a guardian and defender of the Salar de Atacama, this Atacama salt flat. In speaking about the notion of geology, the Licanantay elder speaks back to the researcher. The thing is that it's not geology, it's something different. If we think about it from an ancestral perspective, it's not geology, it's something more like cosmogeology. Tironi observes how this modality of thinking and doing geology clashes with another way of exercising geology in the Salar, that of mining extractivism. Tironi vividly illustrates how extractivism shatters apart worlds in the Salar, entire systems of existence. He enacts the notion of subterranean justice precisely to render visible how geology in the Salar, and we could extrapolate this notion to subterranean justice to analog site, is co-determinist with power and the extent to which the subterranean is also a site for indigenous self-determination and existential justice, not unlike Sky Country. As many astrobiologists in today's webinar would know, the Pilbara region in northwestern Australia holds the oldest convincing evidence of life on Earth, as far as I know. The Pilbara fossils are famous around the world for the window they offer to primeval life. The world's oldest known examples of fossil stromatolites, 3.5 billion years old, found near Marble Bar. There have been reports recently in the media that some of these are being stolen. Scientists and Aboriginal Yamal people have come together to protect the Pilbara's remaining fossils before they disappear. Here, the response to the act of disappearance is quite different. Again, the notion of diffractive reading comes in handy. For astrobiologists, it's about protecting a global treasure, data. But for Aboriginal people, as Yamal Ranger Jamie Haynes illustrates, Aboriginal people view it as we are just passing through. We're not here to change it. We're here to keep it, maintain it, so that other people can pass through. And when you die, you go back into that, so that the hills become your ancestors. The hills are the ancestors. The fossilized microbes are also the ancestors. They are all earth beings, as US-based Peruvian anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena writes in her outstanding book, Earth Beings in the Andean Worlds, where she describes how indigenous ways of knowing and being both include and exceed modern practices. The loss of the oldest known fossil stromatolites is a disaster, no doubt. Cristobal Bonelli, I'm about to finish, is a social scientist, and Cristina Dorador, a microbiologist. This year, she was elected to the Constitutional Assembly, one of a handful of scientists elected to the assembly of 170 people in Chile who are writing a new constitution to replace the 1980 Pinochet-era constitution. A few weeks ago only, they published this article where they used the term microdisaster as a tool for examining how extractivism is disrupting the salt lakes and salt flats in the Atacama and their deep time microbial ecologies. These ecologies are key for understanding early events on Earth, but also they argue how human time is entangled with microorganismic time. I find this connection, or disconnection I should say, between neoliberal extractivist history with geobiological evolutionary history fascinating. Microdisasters, the authors argue, affect us deeply as complex humans and demand from us that we develop further a planet-centered mode of collaborating, thinking, feeling, and acting. Here, we see not only a colonization over space, but also over time, the brief time of capitalist returns over geological and biological evolutionary time. Bonelli and Dorador call for a different microbiological imagination, not that of unlimited data or genetic material, similar to the argument I made about Antarctic bioprospecting. For them, what is being lost are deep time relations, relations not understood as the secondary outcomes of pre-existing discrete entities, but as a continuous immanent flux of relations of dependence and interdependence, a diffractive reading again. A new mode of imagination of space future is one reason that brought me to make the speculative experimental documentary, which I filmed entirely in Antarctica between 2011 and 2014. In collaboration with Maori performance artist Victoria Hunt, we fabulated a character, a Maori astrobiologist, Dr. Xue Nun, working for NASA in the year 2043 in Antarctica, heading an expedition searching for extremophiles as preparation for the first human spaceflight to the Jovian system and the moons of Europa. So to fabulate the character, we took inspiration from tropes from Afrofuturism and indigenous futurism, but also from Victoria's own history. Again, we start from where we are. Victoria comes from a lineage of Matakite women, seers into the mist, seers into the future and the past in traditional Maori knowledge. So she's a fabulated character of fiction as well as social reality, created from ethnographic interviews with astrobiologists and marine biologists, as well as records and plans by NASA. So if you haven't had the time to watch the film, it's available for free on Vimeo, Nightfall on Gaia. We are collaborating with Victoria on a sequel, and it's probably, we would like it to be more engaging with analog sites this time. In conclusions, I hope these random and messy notes presented today make some sense to you all. Astrobiology has been said to have clear existential implications, and the social sciences and humanities and the arts are called upon to play a role in helping to prepare for the possible discovery one day of life beyond Earth, or understand the likely theological, ethical, and worldview impacts on society. But as I tried to illustrate today, hopefully I succeeded, it also exceeds this role to imagine that another astrobiology might be possible, to paraphrase the slogans of another world is possible and another science is possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan. It was absolutely fantastic and really quick tour of a really rich literature coming from different fields, which we will have the time later to kind of like go into in a bit more detail. Very much a shared interest with AstrobiologyOU, particularly in terms of how we have thought about the relation between ethics and methodologies and the creation of an ethics kind of guidance for our group in absence of other kind of institutional ethical commitments for kind of the physical sciences. So that said, I'm just going to ask the panelists to please unmute themselves and to come on video, and I'll just leave it to Shonil, Karen, and Nisha. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Juan. That was fascinating. I think the viewpoint that you presented for looking at astrobiology from the outside, it really highlighted the deep entanglements of astrobiology with anthropology. And this is a viewpoint that perhaps resonates with my own viewpoint as well. So what I'm hoping to do in the next 5 minutes in this short intervention is look at astrobiology from the perspective of someone who is not an astrobiologist, but has increasingly been involved in discussions about astrobiology and has been reflecting over how it is related to my own work, background, and interests. So if you permit me, I'm going to speak autobiographically, drawing on my engagements with the members of AstrobiologyOU and with some of the literature that underpins the ethical questions that astrobiology stirs up. I think AstrobiologyOU has brought people together in ways that we couldn't have imagined. As a relatively new discipline or a field of knowledge, as Juan called it in his keynote, astrobiology is not constrained perhaps by canonical traditions or rigid conceptual frameworks that many other disciplines are. And this, in some sense, is quite liberating because it makes room for quite innovative and interdisciplinary inquiries. AstrobiologyOU has started to do that, and I feel fortunate to be part of it. My own background and interests cut across natural and social sciences, and my work has always been at the interface between human environment systems. The signature of life that astrobiology is interested in does not feature humans, obviously, and yet the places where astrobiologists work, the analog sites on Earth where life in the extremes can be found, are often places that have long histories of human presence, and therefore an understanding of human environment systems, I feel, is important for astrobiology. And Juan really elegantly pointed out those entanglements of how human and environment systems sit together in analog sites. There are three different areas where my own work on human environment systems intersects with astrobiology. The first area is my work on indigenous peoples, their environmental worldviews, their practices, and their cosmologies. My entry point into this was through sacred sites, places of spiritual or religious significance to people. The places where astrobiologists tend to do fieldwork and gather samples are often considered to be remote, unreachable wastelands. And yet for indigenous peoples, these places have very strong cultural, spiritual, and religious values. This points to a very different cosmology, different ways of thinking about the natural world, different worldviews that inform indigenous people's engagements with these environments. So working with astrobiologists and exploring the cultural meanings of places where astrobiology fieldwork unfolds is a very productive area of work. At a practical level, perhaps a lot of work needs to be done with reconciling the values, beliefs, and practices associated with particular places and the values, beliefs, and practices that scientists bring with them. This is really, really important, and it's important to develop those partnerships and collaborations with indigenous peoples and the custodians of the analog sites that are based on mutual understanding and trust. The second area of my work is on biodiversity, and my particular interest in biodiversity is biodiversity in the Anthropocene, the age of humans. Some of my research in the long-term development of biodiversity uses archival material that shows what the biological inventory of a place looked like hundreds of years ago compared to today. There are obviously excellent research techniques in paleoecology, the study of ecology of fossil plant and animal communities that take us back in time, a bit like a time machine. Astrobiology is interested in how ecological communities develop in extreme environments to enable us to draw out some principles for the development of life on other planets. And I think a long-term ecological perspective is important for a better understanding of how these ecological communities develop, thrive, persist, or even perish, and perhaps spot those micro-disasters that Juan talked about in his keynote. So I think for astrobiology, it is important to think beyond what is here and now, looking back at the past biodiversity of a particular place, might give some quite extraordinary insights into how ecological communities go through upward and downward cycles over long periods of time. And this time dimension will be particularly valuable when looking for signs of life on other planets. The third area where my work intersects with astrobiology is alien or non-native invasive species. These are species that were introduced to places by people, species that don't belong to the land that they have been introduced to. yet some of them have demonstrated an amazing ability to survive and even thrive by becoming invasive. These species are often extremophiles in the earthly sense of the term, of course, and they give an excellent insight into resilience of species to survive beyond the environmental thresholds that other species struggle to cross. Astrobiology expands the discussion about species as thresholds, their capacity, their resilience, their ability to survive in extreme environments beyond Earth. For example, tardigrades, the water bears, are microscopic living creatures that are known to survive poor conditions on Earth by drying themselves out and slowing down the processes that support life. A European Space Agency mission in 2007 proved that tardigrades can survive exposure to space, and the 2019 Israeli mission to the moon included some to see if they did indeed survive. So it strikes me that if we look for life at the extremes, tardigrades might be among the first ones that we are likely to spot. So I think there are some very interesting parallels between factors that make a species invasive, able to survive extreme conditions, and the factors that might support life on other planets. So there's a lot to be said about learning from these survival strategies that invasive species adopt, and how they might relate to the survival strategies of life, or possible life on other planets. So I have highlighted here 3 examples where my work on indigenous peoples, on how biodiversity changes over time, and on non-native invasive species that survive in the extremes has some interesting crossovers with astrobiology. In the international development work stream of AstrobiologyOU, we have started to explore the questions of ecological justice by looking at specific places where astrobiologists do fieldwork. We are yet to explore the questions of biodiversity change over time or the drivers of resilience of invasive species. But I'm confident that the group is very well placed to explore these questions and many others that do not sit comfortably in any one discipline. Thank you.
Thank you, Shonil. I'll leave it to Karen.
So I'm going to come from this from a very different angle, because as a scientist, as an astrobiologist and microbiologist, I always seem to feel like I'm looking down and rather than looking up. And I am going to follow on from where Juan started his story about New Zealand and Australia. I actually did my PhD in New Zealand studying extremophiles, which is a hot pot of it's a fantastic location for studying these microbes because they have some of the best analog, best extreme environments in the world for doing this. But as a PhD student many moons ago, I wasn't aware of the cultural implications of the work that I was doing. I had nothing to do with understanding the ecological perspective of this and the importance of the communities that I was studying in the context of the Maori iwi, their tribe narrative. So the microbe I studied, I was given in a test tube and told to go and work on this microbe, which was one of the most extreme environments from a microbe that could survive high pH and high temperature. And I spent 3 years studying this microbe without actually understanding the environment that it came from. I knew the conditions, the physical chemical environment of where it came from, but I knew nothing about the role of that environment within the indigenous and local communities of that area. And it wasn't until many years later, where I actually visited the site where this microbe was isolated, that I heard about the story about where the site, how this site evolved. So it was isolated from the microbe I worked on was isolated from a site called Te Araha, which in Maori translate to the mountain of love. And basically, the legend has it that this legends have it that a Maori tribesman was on this mountain and looked down over the valley and could see his home and was like, well, this is love. This is where I found love. And then the legend goes on about how this environment and these hydrothermic systems were involved, and how they're part of the New Zealand, the Maori iwi legend about how they had properties that they could support and help, healing properties. So what happened was that the Maori community would use this environment, these sites, to go and do rituals when they got married to ensure that they had a safe and happy married life. So my whole PhD was focused in New Zealand, and I was very much aware of the Maori culture, but not how my science could interact with that at all. And it wasn't until probably I started working at the Open University, where I started working particularly with analog sites, and I started doing some work in Ethiopia. So I was lucky enough to go to the Dalal hydrothermic regions in Ethiopia, which is deemed one of the most extreme environments on Earth, and no pictures can justify it. It is highly, beautiful colors. It's highly acidic. And the noise and the environment there, is really, really extreme, and it has been dubbed, a fantastic analog for early Martian environments. And it was only until probably about 5 years ago that this analog site opened up, because as was mentioned previously, a lot of these analog sites are kind of in remote environments. So this opened up due to the infrastructure that was put in place. They put in roads for the tourist industry. So I was lucky enough to be one of the first groups, part of the first European groups to go there and do some work in this environment. And what is interesting is when I compare my experience of being in New Zealand to the work I was doing in Ethiopia, is the difference in the way that they look after their sites. And the Dalal region is a sacred site for the local indigenous people in Ethiopia, but it is overrun by scientists and tourists. There's no barriers around it. You can walk into these sites. They're very dangerous, but you can still do that. And there's no actual regulations involved there. And as part of the work we did, we had to stay in a local community, in a local village there. And this community, a lot of its work, a lot of its economy was driven either by the salt pans, where they were mining their salt from the local regions, but also from tourism and scientific trips going out to these hydrothermic areas. And the first thing you notice when you drive into these communities is the amount of rubbish, the amount of plastic bottles that you have. And that is due to the impact of scientists and ecotourism going to these places. And to me, it was very eye-opening. And when you go to these settlements, we have the village sitting on the right, and then you have the scientists have a camp on the left with the military base just down the road. And they're very much, there's no inter conversations about between the scientists and the local indigenous communities. It's very much focused, scientists are very much focused on getting there, getting their samples and the data that they want. Working in these environments are not easy. We have to go very early in the morning because it can reach up to 50 degrees in these environments. So, it is a very challenging environment at the best of times, but there wasn't a relationship between the indigenous communities and the scientists. And it's only recently now, talking to people like Ali, where I realized that, we're missing out on a wealth of information from having these communications about ecological knowledges and how that could impact scientific knowledge. And it's very difficult to have those conversations, particularly when you're in the field. So you need to have that kind of engagement strategy kind of before you go. And I think this is where kind of my experience and journey in ethics and astrobiology evolved, because I was really disappointed with the work that we did over there. I was there as part of a European consortium, and I just felt that we didn't integrate and that there wasn't that communication and that respect. I didn't think that there was respect from the scientific community that was needed in that area. And naively, as a white European, I felt that what I could do to help that was to go back and teach them. So what I did 6 months later was with a colleague at Bologna, we got some funding, we went back over and we worked with the University of Macaulay to set up a school over there where we taught teachers from the Afar region about their local environment, with the idea that they'd go back into their communities and teach. But looking back now, after my work with Ali and people like Anne, I realized what we did was just, I felt that we were doing the best thing possible at the time. But we weren't co-creating material with with the local indigenous people, we were going there and preaching to them, I think. And I think this is something which I've learned from working with social scientists, that although scientists, we think that we are doing the right thing at the time, actually when we open up and start talking to other disciplines and the local indigenous communities, we actually realize that there's other things that we could do to help and support those environments and those populations. And I think that's something that's key, and something that we've been trying to do is kind of bring that across into the astrobiology community within Europe through our work with the EAI. I think kind of in my dream ideal world going forward, we have a lot of regulations in place about the transfer of genetic materials from one country to another. I know we mentioned Antarctica as a wealth of genetic material, but there's regulations involved, there's legalization and regulations involved where we can't do that. I think this is what we need as an astrobiology community, is to have an ethics guideline principles for when we go and do this analog work, just to ensure that we have that environment set up and ensure that we work with local communities. Now, some of the work we're working with in Botswana at the moment is working with, is ensuring that we work with the local universities in partnership. So we go out into the field with them and we ensure that we go out into the field with them, we share samples with them and techniques and knowledge. And I think that's the way that we need to go forward with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. I hope we'll have the chance to kind of go a little bit deeper in questions of reconciling knowledges, missing out on knowledge. I think that's all really important points that I'd like us to think through a little bit more. Questions are coming thick and fast in the Q&A box, but please feel free to add them, and then we'll do our best to respond during the Q&A session. Nisha, I'll leave it to you.
Slides, one sec. Okay, so my reflection is really based on some of the discussions that we've been having within the astrobiology group. And I feel quite fortunate to be a part of this group because it's enabled me to really be able to speak with other researchers from a range of different fields, such as ethics, decolonization, and environmental justice, and even governance. And this really made me think about astrobiology and, in the broader sense, space exploration beyond the science. And I think I never really thought about this before because, I've had a very sort of science-centric view of the world. And I never thought of science in general as having any borders. But of course, this isn't the case. And we know this through, we come across these paywalls where just research in general just isn't distributed to everyone around the world. But then I also started thinking a bit more about space exploration in general, and whether or not that's actually and whether or not that's really sort of as global as we like to think of it. So I think it's fair to say that most countries around the world have some sort of satellite communication or Earth observation satellite, or at least some sort of access to them. But there's only really 11 nations that are capable of independently launching spacecraft. And most of these nations will actually, with these launch capabilities, are also really the leaders, or at least part of some of the leaders, concerning the exploration of other bodies in the solar system. So we can already begin to see that we've got this hierarchy developing in space exploration. And this really began to make me think about what kind of nations are really exploring space, conducting the research, but also who's at the table when we start discussing policies or the guidelines that are specific to sort of going out into space. And I think that's a really important question because we do always think about this as a global endeavor, but if only a few nations are actually able to access it and are actually making any of the decisions, how could it really be that? And it's also started to make me think, well, what does this mean for any nation that isn't heavily involved in any of the sort of science research or able to or have any launch capabilities at all? Does this literally mean that they'll just sort of get left behind when we start talking about the benefits that space can provide? And sort of more on a personal level as well. So I have friends and family that live in some of these countries that don't actually have like, I wouldn't say are heavily involved in sort of space science research in general. However, for them, so for my family members and friends, to be able to pursue a career in space sciences in the same way that I have, whether that be in sort of like astronomy, astrophysics, like the geology, or even astrobiology, this would mean for them, this would mean that they'd have to move abroad just to study and, you know, to find a job. And this means that those nations already start losing these workers and these sort of experts in their field. And that's just because some of these opportunities don't really exist. And I think that this sort of space dichotomy that is beginning to exist between the nations really needs to be addressed and examined before we can ever consider sort of space exploration as this sort of global endeavor that it's always sold us to. But I think like one of the things that discussions in the group has really sort of highlighted for me is that we do need you know, experts from a range of the different disciplines to really help us address some of the questions and issues that are starting to arise, especially considering like science can't answer them always. And for me, that really began to make me think more about sort of my research beyond just the science, but also like if there are like some steps that I can take in my career and in my research in itself to sort of help bridge this gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisha. I think your question of who's at the table and the borders of science, I think it was a really good way of kind of like summing up the sort of conversations that we've been having and kind of leading on to the Q&A about basically how do we think about astrobiology and space science otherwise? How do we enact it? So yeah, thank you to all the speakers for coming back on camera. We do have questions, unless you have kind of burning comments after having heard the other ones speak. If you do, I'll take them now. Otherwise, I'll go to the questions. Right, questions then. The first question comes from Anne, and it's directed to Juan, but it's a question about interdisciplinarity. So I think I'd like to open it up also to the other speakers. And Anne is asking, Juan has spoken persuasively about the need to take a holistic approach to understand complex issues, such as posed by astrobiology. What do you see as the barriers to holism and interdisciplinarity? And how do we get better at challenging neat divisions while at the same time respecting multiple points of view?
Thank you, and thank you to Anne for the great question. And always a great question is difficult to answer. I think there's no one model fits all. You know, when you ask about what would be the way forward, I think it depends. And one of the things that I try to highlight today, that it depends on where you are. So that connection to the place from where you are speaking, from where you are, from which you have a connection. So that makes an important difference. Secondly, I think you're right. The respect for our own disciplines is always important. Is, you know, I guess where we come from and what we have to put together in that dialogue of knowledges. And I think we shouldn't be scared of transdisciplinary approaches, you know, that are respectful of individual disciplines, but try to come not just, you know, the interdisciplinary or the multidisciplinary, but transcend some of those limitations of our own disciplines and find new methods, and don't be afraid of experimenting with methods. I think we all agree that the scientific method has been immensely fruitful for the last 200 or 300 years. You know, lots of new discoveries, you know, from health to environment to, you know, all sorts of things. But I think it's also important that it's not the only one. You know, it's one very important process of knowledge making, but not the only one. And it's only 200 years old. And we as a species have been adapting in this planet for at least, what, you know, 200,000 years. 200,000 years. So I think there's a question of respect as well of knowledges, as Shonil was speaking about, and also Karen was, I wish all the scientists were like you, Karen. I was really moved by the honesty in which you spoke. That's why I fell in love with working with scientists, sharing with scientists in Antarctica, many of which shared your views of respect and didn't look down on the social scientists, and were really open to be influenced by indigenous ways of doing things and of being, and how they shape your approach as an astrobiologist. Now, when you work in those analog sites, you definitely have a completely different approach. So that's a partial question, sorry, a partial answer to Anne, because I don't think there's a recipe that I could say, this is how you do it.
I can add something about barriers that Anne asks about. I think long-held canonical traditions or very rigid methodological frameworks within disciplines, to my mind, are the key barriers to doing interdisciplinary work. And that is essentially based on last couple of 100 years of developments in these disciplines. Intellectual developments, conceptual developments, and methodological developments. But I think astrobiology is very refreshing because it doesn't bring that baggage with it. And so if there is any place where disciplinary barriers could be broken, it's a discipline or a field of knowledge like astrobiology, in my view.
Could I add something? Sorry. I was just thinking as well, like, I guess on like a practical level, it is like what Juan and Shonil said about like being able to like just have these discussions and be open to different points of views. But also it's about making like just starting the conversations, like, and admitting that maybe you don't know as much as you think you know about something. And everybody does have like complete different views, even like in our science research. Like I've worked with Karen on projects and she's a microbiologist, I'm a geologist, and we're both coming at these things from different perspectives and not quite understanding what the other one's saying all the time or what they're trying to express. But, you know, we've both taken the time to maybe do a bit more reading about geology for Karen and microbiology for me. And it's sort of like making sure that you put in the extra effort to build up a little bit of understanding to help with the communication, because that's obviously going to be a huge part of like just having any discussion.
Great.
I think it's also important, as talking about barriers, to be mindful of the risks or perils of essentialism. That all scientists are the same, or indigenous people are the same, all science fiction is the same. There was a question there about what is science fiction bringing in when it's all meant to be for selling. I completely disagree with that. Science fiction is one of the most fertile fields of knowledge making and imagination that we can think of, and speculative fiction. And although it's a Western literary form in many ways, it connects with stories. Stories is a method of knowing. Story and storytelling is the ancient science. Pre-modern science is based on stories and storytelling. So I find science fiction incredibly powerful to think outside of the square and as a discipline to discuss with and debate with, such as astrobiology and anthropology. So I'm sorry, I disagree with the comment about science fiction. And it's not the same science fiction. If you're thinking of Hollywood science fiction, yes, I agree. But there's a lot of other speculative fiction. Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin. Ursula Le Guin was the daughter of an anthropologist, and her books are almost, fictional ethnographies of other worlds based on plausible science.
Yeah, I think I just want to say something to kind of relate to that. And as some people on the panel know, like I find that refounding disciplines within different genealogies of thought is a way of doing speculative science, like rethinking the genealogies as ways to rethink the future, and refounding astrobiology, in my view, starting from my situatedness and starting from Giordano Bruno, in a way, Italian philosopher, or on the other side, within like my feminist tradition, through conversations between Ursula Le Guin, Donna Haraway, Lynn Margulis, creating these new genealogies is a form of future building or world making. And I think that's where the interdisciplinary conversations become kind of actual worlding practices. So that's pretty much what I hoped for today, and I think, you know, we're getting there. I want to highlight a question. Karen, you have your hand up.
Yeah,
and then we'll go to Tamara.
Yeah, can I just come in there? Sorry. This does take time, though. I mean, I've been working with Ali now for 2 years, and it's the language. You know, astrobiology traditionally is a cross-disciplinary discipline, like Nisha said. And we think we are world leading the fact that we talk to geologists and microbiologists. We feel that, you know, we are leading it. And then you put people like Ali into the equation and we have to start again. So it's about time and patience. And I think the problem we have is, I'm going to go to that old, you know, is funding, because as a scientist, you're given big money to do these big scientific questions, and there's nothing in the guidelines that say that you have to do it. So it's about having that mechanism to do that and changing the way that scientists view this whole situation, but that is going to take time, and it's just going to nip away at them. And I think that's what Ali's been really good at doing, is kind of like, you know, having those conversations and starting to make it more of an agenda. And we're trying to do that with Europe. And I think, you know, that's something, it is going to be a slow process, because if we want to do it properly, which we do, we don't want it to be a bandwagon that everyone jumps on. We want people to do it because they really believe in it, not because it's a tick box on an ERC grant, which it is at the moment. And I think that's what we need to change, is the perception of this from a scientific perspective. Sorry, Ali, I was on my bandwagon then.
Yeah, I guess to me, the one of the real questions there is how shaky is the terrain, because what the problem is that there aren't particularly easy and generalizable solutions, as Juan was kind of mentioning in relation to essentialism. What we are talking about here is doing kind of some very situated thinking, starting from the problems of very specific kind of groups, and that it's kind of difficult, takes time, and it's painful. And so it's not for everyone. The other thing is that, like, the question, there is so much of a problem of like when things go wrong, and when things go wrong, they go really wrong, and it's really difficult to have these conversations with scientists and tell them that if communities don't grant them permission to access their sites, they just shouldn't go. And it's not all about reconciling, is what I'm trying to say. And that's the more difficult pill to swallow, that there are issues about justice and self-determinations that cannot be overruled by the scientific mind frame. But that's quite a difficult thing to say. So after I've dropped that bomb, Juan, I was wondering if you wanted to respond to Tamara's questions about the notion of sky country. She's asking if you could speak a bit more about it as a place entangled with earth, country, and terrestrial environments, and what kind of place it is, according to the Baguaca Collective. What are the bridges between these two realms, and what expertise is needed to travel between them? Or is this relationality seamless?
Thank you. Thank you, Tamara. I'll say publicly that I'm a big fan of Tamara Alvarez's work, so it's nice to see you. I'm not sure where you are. Yeah, interesting question, important question. Where do we start? I think the song lines that are sung to animate, activate, awaken country, some of them are men's business, some of them are women's business, some of them are public, some of them are private knowledge. As is the tradition here, you know, it puts me a little bit in a complicated situation to go too deep into knowledge that is not mine, that is not my country. So I'd like to acknowledge respectfully if I share the information from what I know. I was trying to use a few definitions of country, which is a complex systems perspective on not just the surface of the world. So in Western views, we have the landscape, which is the surface. So country is not just the surface, it's the subterranean, the forces of the subterranean, the waters, the geology, the magmas, the geological process, and sky country is the stars, the galaxies, the constellations. So sky country is not the immediate sky where the planes fly, but it is a notion of the universe. So caring for country does not separate when you're not just caring for the immediate landscape in which you human are situated, but you also extend that notion of nurturing and caring vertically, up above and down below. I think so. Sky country can be disrupted, and I think that article by the Baguaca Collective, with some stories from an elder, Rawan Maiburu, and other Yolnu women, was about how sky country is being disrupted by some of the space race, and I think it's mostly new space, not necessarily astrobiology or planetary research, but the commercial aspects of new space, and how Guwak, a spirit that travels and inhabits sky country, is responding to that and refusing that way of colonizing space. Sorry, I lost the question in my screen, so I just wanted to read it again. Is it a seamless? I don't know, Tamara. I sincerely don't know. I don't think it's if it's seamless, it's not in the way that we might understand seamless. And I don't know who is allowed to travel and not travel, but I presume it has to do with knowing the song lines and knowing that oral tradition that is passed on orally. So I don't think you necessarily can go and study how you can travel. So I'll just leave it there. It's an interesting question to keep discussing, but I'll just leave it there. At least we're running out of time.
There is another question about, as we are
Sorry,
like,
I'll just say an example that it was told to me that, and I can see that I've been listening to stories, and I listened to this story by a Yolnu elder and a Likanantai elder, and they were quite similar in pointing to a Milky Way above in the sky and another Milky Way underneath subterranean. And in the Likanantai case, a sun in the sky and a sun underneath the earth. Now, these are not things to be taken literally, of course. With every religious or spiritual belief, it's not about finding evidence whether they're true or not, but how they organize relationships among people and between people and their environment. So these are the things that are being broken. These cultural, environmental, social, environmental relationships to country, to environment, that are being disrupted, as Karen was talking about. So I just wanted to make that note.
great, thanks. As we are on anthropological methods, I'll just take a final question that kind of like is about the addition of anthropology into the mix. And the question is a bit provocative, I think, in asking, does the addition of anthropology mean that we're going to be more likely to miss anything novel? And while we're talking about astrobiology as, you know, this speculative kind of way of thinking, isn't anthropology going to keep us more with our feet on the ground? And I think that's an interesting question.
Yep, thank you again to Rachel, and I'm terribly sorry to disagree again with you. My sincere apologies. I don't understand why, the addition of anthropology, I presume, to astrobiology will make things more the same. I don't know. I was the whole night I tried to say the opposite, that anthropology can bring novel ways for astrobiology to be practiced as a fieldwork science, but also as a lab science, both as a hard science and also as a speculative science. So I think anthropology brings a lot of new things, as well as science fiction and indigenous ways of knowing. And regarding the new and the novel, I would say that yes, discovery, novelty, it's important. This discovery of a new treatment, for a certain disease, a discovery of climate change, a discovery of ocean acidification. New things are very important, but it's not always about new things. It's also about remembering all things that we have forgotten or that we don't use anymore. So as many people have told me, from farmers, working with farmers, working with indigenous people, is that there needs to be a lot of work in learning how to remember, rather than putting all the effort always in finding new things when there's a lot of things that to remember. So while I agree that finding novelty is good, I don't think every knowledge making practice should be driven by finding novelty. There's many more ways. Creativity, I don't think, is just about the new.
Thank you so much, Juan. Just maybe to try and link these all to also the sort of work that Karen and I were talking about in relation to Ethiopia. I've been working and I have a collaboration with a wonderful artist that is Gabriella Gamandi, who is Italian Ethiopian. And Gabriella told me a story, and the story, I will give it to you in a minute, but it demonstrates that science stories are not immune from history's facts. And that's something that we need to really consider. The story is about the emissaries of Queen Victoria sent to the Emperor Theodros. And it goes like this: 3 British diplomats reached Ethiopia, sent by Queen Victoria. They were received and hosted with all the honors. But before leaving, they were ordered to wash themselves, clean their clothes, and dust their capes, because not one grain of dust was permitted to leave Ethiopia. I think about this story every time we are talking about the scientific methods of astrobiology, every time we talk about analog environments, and what that grain of dust means to me, to us, and to our situatedness. So I think I'll just wrap up on that image, unless anyone has a final word, and then I'll just close with a few words of thanks. Does anyone want to say anything as a final word? Right, then I'll leave it to...
I'd like to thank you all. I think you have a very, very unique research practice there at OU, and I felt really like I belonged tonight. So I would like to thank you all the way from the Southern Hemisphere for the welcome and the invitation to talk to you all and all the listeners tonight and the questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan, Shonil, Karen, Nisha. Thank you everyone for listening to us. There have been many questions, so we're going to paste in the chat the email address for STEM Communications, so that if you have more questions, we'll be happy to take them after the event. We're going to also paste a link to Juan's film Nightfall on Gaia. If you haven't watched it yet, I really recommend you do so. And we want to know more about the sequel one, so keep in touch. There's going to be 2 other events of this series. One is going to be on inclusion and fairness, and the other one on astroenvironmentalism. Links will also be pasted in the chat. They both have a 4 o'clock start, so you shouldn't miss them. And if you want to know more about AstrobiologyOU, the link on our website will also be pasted in the chat. We have a new open learning collection in which we are trying to bring together all the material on astrobiology that we are creating for different publics. If you want, you're welcome to browse. And now I will just say thank you and good night and good day to everyone, depending on where you are. Bye.